Welcome back to the Timur podcast. My name is James, and I will be your host as you and I investigate the character, conquests, and legacy of the infamous man, Timur the Lame. A warlord who arose in the mid-14th century and carved out for himself a vast empire all across Central Asia. And our goal for this journey is to understand who Timur was. What did he do? Why did he do it? And why does it even matter? Now, before we dive into this, I do have a few announcements. First of all, you're probably aware that it has been a few long weeks since the last episode, episode 3 or episode 4. I don't remember how many there have been. Anyway, I am sorry about this. It's not what I wanted to have happen. But to make what happened short, I lost my job, and I also lost a close friend of mine. So life for me has unfortunately been damage control mode, and I had to put a lot of things on pause, including this show. Now, I'm still unemployed at the moment, but instead of sending out resumes, I wanted to get back into Mongolian history because history is my mode of escape. Anyway, thank you for your understanding through this all. A few people even reached out to me, giving me support. That means a lot to me. Thank you for your understanding. And the second announcement is that today's episode is going to be a bit different than the previous few. As you've probably noticed, the sound quality right now is not as good as it's been in the past. In the past, I've recorded episodes at my local library because they have this great sound booth and production room that I can rent out for free, which is awesome, but unfortunately this week the room was being reserved by others except for like a 40-minute period, which obviously wasn't enough for me to use. So how dare some public library not bend down the knee to me, one individual? Well, anyway, what this means is that I'm not recording at the library, I'm recording in my apartment, which is not nearly as soundproof. I also have neighbors and a stupid 19-year-old cat that's probably going to start whining for his food pretty soon. So this is sort of an experiment, and I can already tell this experiment's not going to go well because the two little girls who live above me just got home from school, and they, just 15 minutes ago, were racing around chasing each other, making a ton of noise. So that's probably going to start up again soon. If you hear the screams of my neighbors and the trampling of feet, just imagine it's the screams of war and the trampling of the hooves of Mongolian horses. So you'll probably hear other things going on. There's a bunch of geese outside. They were honking earlier. Somebody was vacuuming. It's a nightmare here. If it doesn't work out, I will be in the library next week. But thanks for hanging in there. Anyway, okay, back to Mongolian history. If you're joining the show for the first time, welcome. This is a podcast about the life of Timur, I promise, but we haven't quite gotten to him yet. We are slogging our way through the history of the Mongol Empire in order to understand that background to Timur. So far, we have taken a look at the first 4 great Khans, Genghis, Ogedai, Guyuk, and Monk. And so far, because of these 4 dudes, the Mongol Empire, it's doing pretty well. It's actually doing really well. It's doing more weller than any empire has ever been, from a military standpoint at least. It has expanded, has continued to expand, and holds promise to expand even more. And to understand why this nomadic empire has been able to not just survive, but to thrive, well, it's really due to 3 really important things. 3 rules, if you will, that the Mongols have followed up until this point in history. And you probably know that I love lists and figurative rules, so let's go ahead and look at these 3 rules that has allowed for all of these Mongolian successes up until this point in history. So this first rule that the Mongols have been able to follow is that the Mongol military machine has been invincible. Well, pretty much invincible. Sure, they may have lost a skirmish or a battle here and there, but every key battle, every war, the Mongols have not just won, but crushed their opposition. The Jurchen in China, the Mongols win. Korea, Mongols win. The Khwarezmian Empire, Mongols win. Abbasid Caliphate, defeated. The Rus and the Cumans, been there, done that. Hungary, defeated. Poland, defeated. The Song Dynasty of China, and it's a work in progress, but mostly defeated. Because, this war has been going on for decades now, but it's clear that the Mongols do have the upper hand. So, there are no Chinese armies pillaging their way through the heartland of Mongolia. So, for the most part, the Mongol armies have been unstoppable. Now, why is this important? Well, for many reasons. Being overwhelmingly victorious discourages rebellion from conquered peoples, it discourages foreign enemies from attacking, it discourages different political Mongolian families or entities from questioning the supremacy of the Great Khan, and most importantly, constant successful warfare keeps the people and the soldiers united. It's funny, but a constant flow of slaves, gold, and wealth has this amazing way of keeping the benefactors united. And so far, from Genghis Khan to Monk Khan, this system has worked. The Mongols keep winning. But what you and I want to know is, how long can this keep up? Well, we're going to find out really soon. The second reason, though, that this whole Mongol thing has ever worked in the first place is that every transition of power has been relatively seamless. In every empire or kingdom or monarchy, the most crucial and dangerous time is when the ruler dies, because there's this power vacuum, and somebody or anybody can take his or her place. Now, this is even more dangerous for people who are traditionally nomadic, traditionally tribal, and don't have that age-old government system to elect a new leader. Well, remember that Genghis Khan foresaw this. And so, as he got older, he worked on establishing a system in which he could transfer his power easily over to the next great Khan, which was Ogadai. And there was no civil war, no revolution, just an easy next great Khan. And as we saw, it worked, rather perfectly actually. Ogadai became the second great Khan pretty much just like that. And this is just kind of incredible, as historian Beatrice Manns thinks that this foresight and act was Genghis's most incredible accomplishment. Accomplishment. Not uniting the Mongols, not conquering a third of Asia, no. This, making sure the empire lived on easily after his death. But again, what you and I are interested in is how long can this system last? Well, let's see. Genghis to Ogadai, the transfer is good. Ogadai to his wife Torajan, it's pretty good. Torajan to her son Guyuk, it's okay. Guyuk to his wife Ogul-Hamish, not so good. Ogul-Hamish to Monk, not good at all. There's a coup, some of the royal family are executed, and things are pretty ugly. So every passing transition of power has progressively gotten uglier to the point where royal princes from the line of Ogadai are being hunted down and executed so that Monk can reign supreme. Still though, to the Mongols' credit, there hasn't yet been a great civil war. There have been a few close calls, maybe a battle or two, but no empire-wide civil war. Well, again, how long can that system last? Third, and finally, the third rule that's really keeping this whole Mongolian system alive was that every great Khan up until this point has been a Mongol. Now, this is true ethnically, but I'm referring exclusively to the cultural meaning of Mongol. Genghis Khan had made this empire because he was brutal. He knew death, he knew hardship, he was accustomed to riding on a horse for weeks at a time, and he was not afraid of killing. And that brutal but efficient personality was what the Mongols had in heaps, because they were a people who survived on the steppe, one of the most godforsaken areas in the world. And again, Genghis, being the mastermind that he was, knew that by conquering rich, settled lands, his troops, his people, and especially his sons, would be wooed by the luxuries. And so he warned them, yes, enjoy the spoils of war, enjoy the gold and the women and the wine, but remember your heritage, remember the steppe. Don't become some couch potato lapping up Chinese wine and Russian butter. Well, how did this play out? Sort of great and sort of terribly. Ogadai, the next Khan, well, he's obese, he's a glutton and a drunkard, possibly a sex addict. Not what Genghis had in mind when he said don't become a prisoner to luxuries. And yet, Ogadai was still a Mongol, a man who traveled the steppe, who knew how to conquer, he knew how to win the loyalties of the soldiers. He remembered the hardships he had weathered, and he sent his own sons to go out and fight and travel across the steppes so they too would be shaped and formed by those plains. Well, next up is Guyuk. And Guyuk, was he actually still culturally a Mongol? Yeah, actually, pretty much perfectly. Guyuk was the sort of ideal Mongol, a true warrior, a man who preferred the company of other soldiers, who was eager to do battle, constantly on a horse, ready to conquer all of your look, he's dead. Unfortunately for Guyuk, he was susceptible to certain luxuries of the conquered. Smooth wine, rich red meat. Well, it killed Guyuk before he could really show the world who he was, what potential he had. Well, how about the next guy? How about Monk Khan? And again, credit where credit is due. Monk was a true Mongol, a true warrior, a great warrior who expanded the empire to heights never seen before. But again, the same question comes up. How long can this hold up? Because we understand these rules. As long as these 3 rules are followed, the Mongol Empire will be okay. Not just okay, but unstoppable. Successful wars, easy transition to the next ruler, and that next ruler being culturally a traditional Mongol. But what if one of these rules is broken? Or what if all 3 rules are broken by the same man? What happens then? Well, everybody, if you haven't met him before, meet Kublai Khan. Kublai breaks, or at least is in power when the Mongols break these 3 rules. So let's look at rule number 2, the transition of power. The date is August 11th, 1259. Monk, the 4th Great Khan, is dead. And unfortunately, there's a little bit of a disagreement on who's next up on the list, because Monk left behind 3 brothers, all of whom were powerful, rich, had a couple armies lying around, and all of them wanted to be the next Great Khan. And if Mongol history has taught us anything, it's that there's really no such thing as brotherly love among the family of Genghis Khan. The Mongol brothers are very willing to backstab each other. They're willing to do it and eager to do it. So let's look at these 3 brothers who all want to be the 5th Great Khan. First up is Kublai, and he's been with his older brother Monk every step of the way. Actually, they had a bit of a falling out and almost fought a war against each other, but thankfully, Monk forgave Kublai. Kublai saw the error of his ways. So, wow, actually, here are 2 brothers who, they were able to work things out. And as we touched on last week, Monk put Kublai sort of in charge of the Mongolian conquest against the Song dynasty in China, because remember, that war it's been going on for like 1 trillion years, and it's just sort of a staple of Mongolian history. So anyway, that's where Kublai is, leading troops in China, studying how the Chinese fight, kind of fighting fire with fire, but through this, he's learning their ways, he's adopting their tactics, he's talking to their great leaders and thinkers, blah blah blah, you get it. Kublai is basically being eaten by Chinese culture, and he's loving it, he's embracing it. Next up, Monk also had a brother named Hulagu. Now, Monk told Hulagu to lead the Mongol conquests in the Middle East when Monk was Great Khan. Remember back to last episode, it was Hulagu who sacked Baghdad and destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate in modern-day Iraq. It was Hulagu who went through Anatolia and Syria and Georgia, pillaging everything and defeating anybody who opposed the Mongols, bringing most of the northern half of the Middle East into complete Mongol control. So Hulagu is way out there doing that when Monk dies. Finally, Monk also had a brother named Erik Boka. And Erik Boka wasn't commanding any armies or fronts like his 2 other brothers. No, he was back in the Mongolian heartland, running business and political matters there, and in doing so was really starting to get buddy-buddy with the old Mongolian aristocracy. That is, the old families who had been with Genghis Khan since day one, had grown rich, felt like the empire owed them stuff, things like that. Anyway, so here are the 3 brothers. Those are their situations. So when Monk dies, all 3 of them jump up to see which of the other 2 brothers, what are they going to do? Who will be the first guy to act? Well, it's Erik Boka. Being in Mongolia with the old families, as soon as Erik hears that Monk Khan is dead, he gets everybody together, well, almost everybody, at a Kurultai, and to nobody's surprise, Erik is elected as the next Khan. And just for good measure, Erik Boka, he starts assembling a massive army, just in case his brothers have any qualms with him doing so. Now, as you've probably noticed, both Hulagu and Kublai were not invited to the Kurultai, which is kind of odd. I'm sure, though, that they're taking it well. No, they're also preparing for war and marching on Mongolia. Well, that just can't be good. So let's look at what both Hulagu and Kublai are doing. Let's look at Hulagu first. So Hulagu is in control of the Mongolian-controlled Middle East, and things are going pretty well there for the Mongols. So Hulagu, upon hearing that his brother Erik made himself Khan, he's a little mad about this. So he goes and gets his boys together, and they head towards Mongolia with haste. No doubt to dispute with his brother about, who gets to rule next. But then 2 critical things cause Hulagu's journey to grind to a screeching halt and forces him to return to matters in the Middle East. First of all, the big problem is that the Mongols are currently being attacked by the Mongols. Okay, let me explain. So this will become very important later on, but the Mongol Empire is sort of organized into different territories, which makes sense for things like taxing and rule and whatnot. But each of these territories are, of course, servant to the Great Khan. Well, that works in theory, but sometimes these different territories kinda sorta like to do their own thing. Yeah. They're part of the Mongol Empire, but hey, maybe they want to do a little bit of expanding on their own, you know? Well, there are primarily four of these districts, if you will. Now, they're usually called the Khanates, or sometimes you'll see them being called uluses. Anyway, here's what these four Khanates are very roughly. The first Khanate that is part of the Mongol Empire is called the Ilkhanate, which at this point in time is composed of modern-day Iran, Iraq, Eastern Turkey, Armenia, Georgia, the country, not the state, okay, enough with that, Syria, Azerbaijan, parts of Lebanon. This is the region in the Middle East that Hulagu is in control of. He's overseeing it. The second Khanate is the Chagatai Khanate, which was modern, well, what's now Central Asia, Eastern Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, parts of Western China, places like that. The third Khanate was, well, it's about to get renamed in the story, but for now we'll just call it the Heartland Khanate, which was Mongolia, Korea, and the parts of China that had been conquered thus far. And lastly, the fourth and best named Khanate was simply called the Golden Horde. And the Golden Horde controlled modern-day Kazakhstan, Western Russia, the Ukraine, places like that. Now, these four Khanates are really, really important to, well, all of history, but particularly the life of Timur, who we still haven't really talked about. Well, we'll get to him, so try to remember these four Khanates, and I'll be reminding everybody as we keep going, because I need the reminder too as to, who's who and what's what. But just remember that the Mongolian Empire is composed of these four smaller, well, for now they're regions, but later on they'll be empires of their own. Anyway, back to the story of Hulagu. So Hulagu wants to travel to Mongolia, but is forced back because the Ilkhanate, that is the Mongolian-controlled Middle East, led by Hulagu, they're being invaded. By who? By the Golden Horde, who are also Mongols, yes, but the Mongols of the Golden Horde are now attacking the Mongols of the Ilkhanate, even though they're all part of the same empire. So what's really happening? Well, again, a lot of times, the leaders of these different Khanates just kind of do their own thing. And Burke, or Burke, the leader of the Golden Horde, sees the death of Monk as a great time to gobble up some new territories, particularly the area of what today we call Azerbaijan, Georgia, and parts of Kazakhstan. Why these places? Well, all of these regions have incredible pasture land, and pasture it's worth more than gold to nomadic horse armies because, well, they need it for the horses, obviously. So now Hulagu has to race back to deal with this. And what happens is that, not a whole lot, actually. There's a bit of fighting, there's a few battles here and there, but the whole war is pretty much inconclusive. The important thing is, though, is that now Mongols are fighting Mongols for the first time. That's not a good sign. Anyway, the second reason why Hulagu has to rush back, and this kind of, well, it actually happens before the Golden Horde attacks him, but I'm only getting to it now because I live to make your life more confusing. But the Mongols are finally checked in the West by another rising superpower. A superpower that has enough strength to march against the Mongols and actually poses a threat to them. And this was the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. And I want to take a look at the Mamluks really quick just because they're so interesting. So going way back, very on in the early 8th century, back to the Muslim conquests immediately following the death of the Prophet Muhammad. Well, during these conquests, the land of Egypt was one of the first regions to fall. And since then, Egypt became a very important and powerful player in the Islamic world, eventually becoming their own independent sultanate. Well, this brings on wars with other Islamic neighbors. It brought on wars with the Seljuk Turks, who went sweeping through the Middle East in the 11th century. It brought on wars with the Byzantine Empire, wars with the Christian kingdom of Abyssinia, which is in modern-day Ethiopia, wars with pirates, and now here are the Crusaders. So now Egypt is fighting Crusaders as well. All this to say, the Egyptians needed soldiers. And not just soldiers, but super soldiers, professional soldiers. Not your militia or farming rabble, but men who do nothing except fight. Thus, the Mamluks were born. Who were the Mamluks? Well, they were sort of everybody. Turks, Syrians, Armenians, Greeks, Ethiopians, all sorts of people. But they were boys brought, getting ahead of myself, bought or captured as slaves and brought back to Egypt. And here back in Egypt, these boy slaves were trained and brought up in nothing but the art of warfare. They were slave soldiers, but not really treated as other slaves because they quickly rose as their own sort of class in Egypt because they were the best fighters in the region, maybe even in the world. And thus the Mamluks were unleashed against the enemies of Egypt, and they defeated Crusaders, everyone, Bedouins, Abyssinian tribesmen, rebels, the list goes on and on. Only the finest of Crusader knights were deemed to be equal opponents to the Mamluks. And if you're a Game of Thrones fan, yeah, the Unsullied in Game of Thrones are probably based off of the Mamluks or other similar slave soldiers. Anyway, after just win after win, the Mamluks begin to realize that they don't have to take crap from anybody. Wait, if literally nobody can beat us in battle, why in the world are we still slaves? So long story short, the Mamluks rebelled and took control of Egypt, beginning the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. And this would last for centuries. And that's all fine and good, but here come the Mongols, sweeping through Iraq, leveling Baghdad, subjecting the Turks and the Georgians and the Syrians to just terror and conquest and subjugation. And now it looks like the Mongols might want to take all of the Levant and then march right into Egypt as well. While the Mamluks will have none of this, and so Egypt assembles her warriors. Now the year is 1260, and Hulagu is rushing back to Mongolia to dispute the throne with his brothers, all that family stuff, when all of a sudden he hears about a little battle back in what's modern-day Israel, the Battle of Ain Jalut. And this battle occurred on September 3rd, 1260, between the Mamluks and a Mongol army. And what happened? Well, for really the first time we've seen, the Mongols are decisively defeated. They may be warriors, but the Mamluks are nothing but warriors. And so the Mongols retreat, and Syrian lands are given back to the Mamluks. Not only did the Mongols just lose a key battle, but now they're giving back lost territory. Well, Hulagu can't have this, so he rushes back to put out the fires, quite literally, and then, as I mentioned earlier, the Golden Horde attacks from the north. All this to say, Hulagu is in no place to claim the title of Great Khan, so, well, he doesn't. And so that leaves Kublai, who is not going to stand for his younger brother, Erik Boka, declaring himself as Great Khan. So what does Kublai do? Well, he holds his own Kurultai with his own supporters and his own party, so now he claims he's the Great Khan. So now, great, we have two Great Khans. Erik Boka is in Mongolia and has the support of most of the old Mongolian aristocracy, and then Berke, or Berke, ruler of the Golden Horde, also announces that he supports Erik Boka. Then, on the other hand, you have Kublai, and he has almost all of the support of the Chinese rulers under Mongol occupation, and then also Hulagu, over in the Middle East, he throws his support behind Kublai. My friends, what we have here is a total Mongol civil war. And it's often called the Toloid Civil War because these are the descendants, these are the sons and grandsons of Toloid, the fourth favorite son of Genghis Khan himself. So hold on a minute. The Mongols were defeated by the Mamluks. For the first big time ever, the Mongols are losing a war. Well, this breaks rule number 1 we established earlier. But what's more, we've got a full-blown civil war at this point. There is not going to be any easy succession from Monk Khan to whoever's going to be the next Great Khan. So, rule number 2 is broken. Civil war it is. So what happens? Well, war happens, to put it shortly. From 1260 through 1264, Kublai and his allies battle it out against his brother Erik and his allies. Now, the war is sort of complicated, but here are the basics. Erik has more political allies, but he doesn't really know how to run a war. Kublai does know how to run a war. That's what he's been doing, and he's also in control of all those elite Mongolian armies that have been battle-hardened by this ongoing, never-ending war with the Song dynasty in China. You can probably see where this is going. So Erik takes the capital of Karakorum. Kublai approaches with an army. Erik retreats. Kublai takes Karakorum. Kublai then beats an ally of Erik in a battle. Thinking the winter will be harsh, there's a rebellion back in China, and, the war's pretty much over at this point. Kublai pulls back. The war is not over. Eric returns, takes Karakorum back, and then Kublai returns. They battle each other. Kublai wins the first battle, but he doesn't pursue, which allows Eric to battle for a second time, and that battle is indecisive. In all of this, Karakorum, the city, is leveled to the ground. It's just a mess, but Kublai does have the support and the troops that he needs to keep this going, at least for now, whereas his brother Eric is out of troops, out of supplies, and almost all of his allies have fled. Thus, in 1264, Eric surrenders to Kublai, concluding the civil war. Now, Kublai warmly embraces and forgives his brother Eric, treating him like some sort of prodigal son. I forgive you for wrongly proclaiming yourself Great Khan, and I forgive you for that whole war thing, but I'm gonna have to execute pretty much everybody else who had a hand in your little teenage rebellion stage. But as for Eric, he is actually treated pretty well by Kublai. He's technically a prisoner, sure, but he's allowed to do his own thing, and then he mysteriously dies and disappears from history just a few years later. We'll never know what happened, but a lot of people think Kublai killed him. I'm not going to point fingers, though. Anyway, here we are. Kublai is now the only Great Khan, the 5th Great Khan of the Mongol Empire. So let's talk about his reign. Well, he reigned for a long, long time, from 1260 until his death in 1294. And really, he deserves his own podcast to discuss all the things he did. I mean, he's incredible, and it's no surprise that so many people at least recognize the name Kublai Khan, more so than really any other Khan. But what's funny about this guy is that even so, he's a total rule breaker. We talked about those 3 rules earlier. Well, obviously there was no easy, bloodless transition of power from monk to Kublai. Kublai had to fight this whole civil war against his brother. And there's another civil war coming on down the road, but we'll get to that. And then also, with rule number 1, the Mongols broke it. They are not invincible anymore. They lost a really decisive battle against the Mamluks. Well, hey, at least Kublai is Great Khan. He knows all about war, and he's not going to lose a bunch of wars and invasions that will forever destabilize and doom the Mongol Empire, will he? Well, let's take a look at Kublai's military campaigns, of which there are many. First off, the Mongols are still fighting that pesky Song dynasty in China, who they have been fighting since the days of Ogedai Khan. This war, all in all, lasted for like 45 years, and killed millions of people. It began in 1235, and it was not until Kublai finally finished the job in 1279 that the Song were finally defeated by the Mongols. So actually, that's a tremendous victory for Kublai, and that's really how he starts his whole career. So well done, Kublai. Oh, but bad news, Korea is rebelling at the same time. Thankfully, Kublai's on top of this. He makes an up-and-coming Korean prince, his son-in-law, sends that son-in-law back to Korea, problem solved. Well, now that this is all taken care of, it is time to expand. So where to, Kublai? Well, in 1264, the Mongols invaded the island of Sakhalin, and I know I'm saying that wrong, so I'm sorry about that, but this island is actually a pretty sizable island off the coast of Siberia. And this invasion does not go too well. The Mongols win a few times, they lose a few times, but the Sakhalin people, they're up for the fight. And they even attack Mongol positions in Mongolian territory at one point, and this war goes on for, like 44 years, until finally in 1308, the Sakhalin people finally submit to Mongol rule. Now, mind you, this is years after Kublai has died that the island finally submits to Mongol rule, so, I guess that's a victory for Kublai, but not during his lifetime. Okay, well, where to next? How about Burma? So in 1277, the Mongols do what the Mongols do best and invaded. And after 10 years of bloody struggle in the jungle, the pagan empire of Burma surrendered. Now, that's not their religion. I guess it was their religion, but they're also just called the pagan empire of Burma. And they surrender after 10 years. So another victory for Kublai, I guess. Well, what's next? Well, here, how about this? How about we do what the Americans and the French and the Japanese will all struggle to do hundreds of years later? Why don't we invade Vietnam? But hey, how about instead of just one Vietnam War, what if we had 3? Yeah, so Kublai orders 3 invasions of the various Vietnamese empires. And the first invasion actually went pretty well. It was back in 1258, before Kublai was even Khan. The Mongols went through parts of northern Vietnam looking for a way to flank the Song dynasty, and yeah, they took a few cities on the way, claiming a victory over the people of Vietnam. Well, this didn't stick, obviously, so Kublai orders another invasion years later in 1285, which is soundly defeated. So he invades again in 1287, and like the entire Mongolian fleet was annihilated. In one case, the Vietnamese drove iron spikes into the bottom of rivers, then they waited for the tide to go down, and then they lured Mongolian ships down the rivers where the spikes tore the hulls of the ships apart, and then the Vietnamese easily shot down the men struggling in the water. Pretty crazy story. So Vietnam proved to be a real Vietnam for the Mongols. Nevertheless, the leaders of the various kingdoms in Vietnam deemed it wise to submit to Kublai finally in 1288, because although they were winning, they probably couldn't continue to do so, and so they wisely submitted. So, I mean, that's sort of a Mongol victory, I guess. Well, where else? Where else is Kublai going to invade? How about Japan? So the Mongols under Kublai organize a massive invasion fleet and army and invade Japan in 1274, and then again in 1280. And you can hear the screaming of the children above me. Well, it works out with this story because both invasions were failures. And they can be summed up with this. The Mongols and the Chinese and the Koreans, they built tons of boats, but these boats are designed for Chinese rivers and not the open ocean. Also, they are really, really rushed. In one case, preparations should have taken 5 years, but they were rushed to be done in 1 year. Also, turns out that Mongols and Mongol horses absolutely hate the ocean. And it turns out that all the Korean soldiers that you brought along, they don't want to be there. So morale is trash. It also turns out that the ocean is not on your side because in both invasions, 2 separate typhoons utterly destroy most of each army and navy, sending them straight to the bottom of the ocean. And there's actually... what are they doing out there? There has actually been some really fascinating underwater archaeological work done on these invasion forces recently, so check that out, it's pretty cool. If I can remember, I will post some links to that. Really neat. But anyway, these invasions are complete failures. And not every Mongol or Chinese or Korean warrior in these armies died, mind you. On more than one occasion, the Mongols did take a few smaller Japanese islands and even defeated a few Japanese forces. In one outrageous story, a Japanese army met a Mongol army, and before the battle, a handful of these Japanese elite warriors, the samurai, valuing nothing more than individual combat and valor, marched forward to fight the Mongols in chivalrous, brave, one-on-one combat. Now, the Mongols, who always fought as a unified body and not really seeing the point to one-on-one combat, just blasted these lone samurai with gunpowder bombs, arrows, javelins, everything. And somehow that story has lived on to this day and age. History is just weird. Anyway, despite a few small victories, both Mongol invasions of Japan were utter defeats. And finally, Kublai also invaded Java in 1293, and again, this invasion was a total defeat. Now, the last military conflict of Kublai's reign that we need to talk about is the Kaidu-Kublai Civil War. That's right, there's another civil war. So after Kublai had defeated his brother Eric, he wanted to make sure that all the other leaders of the empire, particularly the leaders of the other 3 khanates, knew their place and accepted that Kublai was the great Khan. Well, in short, they didn't. Because the Chagatai Khanate, the part of the Mongol Empire that consisted of Central Asia, well, this Khanate was led by a man named Kaidu, and Kaidu refused to bow to Kublai. Kaidu was the male leader of the Ogadai family, and remember that Ogadai's family had control of the Mongol throne with Ogadai and Guyuk. So, hey, there's a case to be made that the title of Great Khan belongs to a descendant of Ogadai, a family member of the Ogadai family. Further, Kaidu has a lot of power and troops and money, and it's not long before the Golden Horde, another one of the 4 Khanates, joins Guyuk in his claim. Not Guyuk. Kaidu. There are so many Mongol names. Okay, so the Golden Horde and the Chagatai Khanate, they're backing Kaidu. Kaidu, leading these 2 Khanates, claims that he should be the leader of the Mongol Empire, while Kublai, with his Khanate in China and Mongolia, and his old allies, the Il Khanate, over in the Middle East, maintain that Kublai is the rightful heir. So again, 2 Khanates are against 2 Khanates, and we will cover this civil war a bit more next week's episode, but basically this is what happens. The war begins in 1268, and lasts until 1301, which is years after Kublai's death. Kublai never sees the end of this civil war. And this is why you pretty much never hear Kublai with the title Great Khan, because, well, he really wasn't. Almost the entire time he called himself Great Khan, the Mongol Empire was split down the middle and in defiance of him. So technically he is the fifth Great Khan, but practically, not at all. But let's take a step back and go back to those 3 rules we looked at the beginning of this episode. Number 1, to survive, the Mongol Empire must remain almost entirely militarily invincible. Have they? Nope. They were defeated in the Levant by the Egyptians, and Kublai has had a whole host of costly and failed invasions in Japan and Java and so on. Well, okay, let's move to rule number 2. Has the power transition from one great Khan to the next been smooth? Because we really need that if we want the empire to survive. But that hasn't happened here at all. Kublai had to fight a whole civil war against his brother Eric for the title, and then almost immediately afterwards he's engaged in another civil war against Kaidu for the title of Great Khan. So finally we get to rule number 3. Is the leader, you broke the first 2 rules, but at least with rule number 3, is the leader of the empire a quote-unquote true Mongol when it comes to cultural issues? Does Kublai remember the steppe? Does he worship the old ways? Is he loyal to the old families? Well, Kublai breaks rule number 3. Not only does he break it, he smashes it. So let's very briefly look at the other aspects to Kublai's reign. I mentioned earlier that Kublai is in control of one of the 4 khanates, which I called his homeland khanate, meaning it entailed Mongolia and China. That's not what it was called, but for convenience's sake, I called it the homeland khanate earlier. But now it's not a khanate. Now it's a Chinese dynasty. Kublai renamed the khanate to the Yuan dynasty of China. Not only that, but Karakorum had been destroyed during the Civil War, and because Kublai wanted to rule from China anyway, he moved the empire's capital to what is today Beijing. So the khanate he rules is now a Chinese dynasty. He rules from China, and he also became a Buddhist. Wait, this guy isn't culturally a Mongol anymore. This guy is culturally Chinese. And this is perhaps what Kublai is best known for. Militarily, he had conquered China, but culturally, China had conquered him. And he loved it. He loved their architecture, their government structure, their wine, their poetry, their writing, their astronomy, their science, their medicine, their training, their tax systems, their religions, everything. And so he begins to call himself Emperor of China or a son of heaven rather than just calling himself the Great Khan of the Mongols. And as we've seen, this makes all of the old Mongol families back home in Mongolia super angry. The civil wars become more of progressive ideas versus traditional ones, of Chinese culture versus the old ways, the Mongolian culture. And Kublai is not interested in solely conquering new lands as his, fathers and grandfathers had done. No, he's interested in building up these lands, particularly China. And this is why Kublai is remembered and respected even today. He was no unbeaten conqueror who bent the world to his will, even though he did conquer new lands. No, he was a man who built societies instead of destroying them. And I've kind of been poking fun at him this whole episode, but really only because I like him, or at least I respect and I admire a lot of what he did. So let's talk about that. What did he do? Well, he repaired the roads, a ton of roads. Further, the empire needs to send messages quickly, so he perfected the imperial mail system that ran on messengers using a system of horses to gallop their way across the empire with messages. And under Kublai's direction, 200,000 horses were constantly on the ready to make sure that the message system remained. He built granaries all across China, filled the granaries full of wheat, and then distributed the wheat back to the people during famines. And if you're familiar with Chinese history, you know that famines hit regularly, and they hit hard, but now there's a way to combat that. Kublai used the state's money to support and care for old scholars, orphans, and the sick, which was kind of an unprecedented idea at that time. Actually, it's kind of still, depending on where you live. But anyway, he worked on that, and he also implemented food programs that would provide for the poor. One dude who saw this actually said that these food programs fed over 30,000 people every day. And the guy I just mentioned, the guy who witnessed it, well, He was Marco Polo, the Italian traveler who made his way all across Asia into the court of Kublai Khan and returned to Europe with these amazing tales and stories and details, marking one of the most important connections historically between China and Europe. And the people above me have started to dance, it sounds like. Anyway, Kublai worked with Buddhists to set up hospitals all across China. He built maybe as many as 20,000 schools. He fixed canals. He made a military academy for army officers. He was remarkably religiously tolerant. He encouraged trade with the rest of the world, poured tons of money into all types of science, gave tax exemption to the most beneficial members of society, even wrote his own poetry, which somehow a lot of it survives to this day. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on about all of the amazing things he implemented in China. And this is why he deserves his own podcast. This is why he's remembered even when other militaristic geniuses like Monk Khan are often forgotten. China would not be, the world would not be like it is today without what Kublai did for that country. But, backing up, we have to go back to those 3 rules we talked about at the beginning of this episode, because they've all been broken. The Mongols have lost a lot of battles, a few wars even. The transition of power was broken and 2 civil wars broke out. And the nearest man to being a true great Khan, Kublai, who's not really the great Khan, well, he's culturally way more Chinese than he is Mongolian. So what does this mean? Well, simply put, there is no more Mongol Empire. What we have here is 4 separate empires, or I guess you could say 2 if you really wanted to boil it down, but Kublai is ruling the Yuan dynasty, and he's allied to the Ilkhanate. The Golden Horde and the Chagatai Khanate are not in submission to him and in open war against him. A united Mongol Empire is no more, and this brings us to the end of Kublai's reign. Now, Kublai knew the importance of leaving behind a clear heir to the throne. He had seen what happened when his brother Monk messed this up, so Kublai is not going to make the same mistake, and he names his son heir. But then his son dies, so he names his other son as heir. But then that son also dies, so Kublai names his grandson as the next guy to take the throne, and this is a man by the name of Timur. Not Timur, but Timur. As for Kublai himself, he lived well into his 70s, but eventually his health did get worse, and he finally died on February 18th, 1294, at the age of 78, so he made it a pretty long time. He was buried in Mongolia alongside the other great Khans of the Mongol Empire, and then, as Kublai wanted, his grandson Timur became the ruler of the Yuan dynasty, but not of a united Mongol Empire. So next week is Christmas, but I'll try and get an episode out, maybe a shorter episode, but I'll try to get something out next week. But soon, in the next episode or 2, we will look at the reign of Timur, the last final breath of a united Mongol Empire, and then we'll get into those 4 Khanates, or pieces of the empire that we were introduced to today. The Yuan dynasty, the Chagatai Khanate, the Golden Horde, and the Ilkhanate. So that puts us right now at the year 1294 with the death of Kublai. What year was Timur born? Well, not everybody agrees on this, but if we take the traditional date, Timur, the guy that this podcast is supposed to be about, might have been born in the year 1336. We're at 1294. We are only like 40 short years away from finally getting to Timur. We're almost there. And I think I mentioned this before, but once we do get to Timur, we're going to take things a lot more slowly to really get into the sources and material. Instead of decade by decade-ish, as we've sort of been doing, we'll be progressing year by year, or actually probably closer to month by month. So that's sort of the plan, and that brings this episode of the Timur podcast to a close. Again, thank you for your patience and your understanding in me not releasing any content the last few weeks due to life being nuts. And also thank you for your patience with this week's episode and the sound quality that is probably not going to be so great. My neighbors started dancing and yelling a few minutes ago, so we'll see how that ends up. If the sound quality really bothered you, or if you didn't really seem to notice or care about it, I would love to hear your feedback, because it's a lot easier for me to record here at home. It's a lot more fun too, but if the sound quality is not as good, and I have a feeling it's not going to be, then I will definitely return to the library. You can reach me on Twitter at podcasttimur, or on Facebook at timurpod, or email me at timurpodcast@gmail.com. And I really appreciate feedback of all types. As you know, I'm new to this whole solo podcasting thing, so feedback is what helps me improve more than anything else. And if you're interested, you can also check out the podcast website at timurpodcast.com for additional info. I haven't updated the show notes in a long time, but I'm hoping to do that over this holiday season. Finally, and most importantly, thank you for listening to the show. I'll see you next time right here on the Timur Podcast.